right, hi everyone. So I am new to YouTube. I have just come over here from TikTok, where I would like to make longer videos in which we talk about in real time events that are happening and really try to break down the real forces and decisions and the real powers at play that are causing these chain of events. That this is not incoherence but strategy, that this is not random but controlled chaos. And so my thesis is based around this idea. Donald Trump is trying to force a global power shift amid US empire decline and de-dollarization into a Trump-led, loyalty-based, transactional economic and political system where he becomes the central signal and deciding force, enabling wealth and power consolidation through imperialism and the transformation of US democracy into authoritarian rule. So what we're going to discuss is the market chaos, the sell-off, the gains that were made for the wealthy elites, the power consolidation that comes from that this is strategic, that there is forces and chains of events that are happening in order for him to distract while he consolidates power at the executive level, the things he's trying to avoid and where his limitations are, and how he uses even his miscalculations to benefit him for his overall restructuring and reorganizing through the use of chaos. This ultimately is trying to create an authoritarian system, one that even the billionaires aren't safe from. So let's go over this chain of events, starting with tariffs. Trump created a climate of uncertainty. Tariffs on, tariffs off, tariffs up, tariffs down. And so what that directly causes is market uncertainty because of supply chain shocks to the system and direct inflation. The thing about markets is markets hate uncertainty. So when we see uncertainty in the markets, we usually see a sell-off and a decline in the markets. And that's exactly what we saw in the NASDAQ, where we saw since Trump got in office here in February, let's say January being the top, to a 25 decrease in the market. When there's volatility, we see a lot of stocks being sold off. That shakes people out of the market. So if you're holding assets, you're panic selling. That creates cheap stocks for that to be later bought off. And it's a transfer of assets and a transfer of wealth. And we saw that recently where Donald Trump was gloating with his wealthy elite friends like Charles Schwab, bragging about how much they made once he sent out the signal that the market was changing.
It's actually an individual. And he made $2.5 billion today, and he made $900 million. That's not bad.
So before all of that occurred, what happened in between? Basically, what he did was he created an uncertain market that started to sell off so that he can basically create recession fears. Basically, wait until he can see that in the headlines, which we saw. Tariffs are fueling fears of a recession. Once that really starts becoming actual headlines in journals and reputable newspapers, it starts really stoking fear and panic, and it starts preparing investors, people in the market, small businesses, everyone, the regular consumer, to basically act differently because we're forecasting a worse future. And what is the point of fears of a recession? Ultimately is for him to pressure the Fed to implement quantitative easing, which was a measure that was implemented during March 2020 that created the bull run of Bitcoin and the altcoins. And Trump is directly invested in the cryptocurrency market with his Trump coin, and we'll go over that as well. So why quantitative easing? Quantitative easing is a monetary policy that's relatively new, since about 2008, in which the Fed injects a bunch of money into the system, drives interest rates low, people start buying higher risk assets, and as we've seen it usually signals a bull run for the cryptocurrency and stock markets, and also props up the real estate market, also, which he is directly invested in. The other part of tariffs is that it is a way to reorganize power, and it's a way to coerce global allegiance, because you create this punish or reward system. So if you have blanket tariffs, that means you effectively resetted your alliances. It doesn't matter if you're an ally. If everyone has a tariff, minus Russia, and there's a reason for that, then Trump basically resets alliances. It forces people to come to him to negotiate a deal, and usually this deal is Trump favored. So it basically creates this punish and reward system, which further entrenches this loyalist economic and political system. At the same time, Trump capitalizes on the volatility of the stock market, because that makes headlines. That's what people talk about, while he's currently expanding executive power in a way that we've never seen. So what we saw were mass layoffs. Even though he ran on a platform of job creation, we saw layoffs in the thousands from career government officials. He reinstated Schedule F, which was an executive order from his first term, and that basically allows him to replace government officials with loyalists. We saw the dissonance of a Trump-appointed government official like Linda McMahon as the Secretary of Education. And if you don't know who Linda McMahon is, you probably know her husband, Vince McMahon, who was a professional wrestling promoter. There's recently a video circulating of Linda McMahon talking about AI in schools and repeatedly referring to AI as A1.
Have A1 graders or even pre-Ks have A1 teaching, every year starting, that far down in the grade.
So we are seeing that these are not qualified individuals, but people who can reinforce Donald Trump's agenda. At the same time, we're seeing mass deportations, visas revoked for international students that have protested for Gaza, the use of Guantanamo Bay for migrant detention, and then now the use of an international country for migrant deportation and migrant detention. And recently, we're seeing the escalation of criminalizing dissent, even for U.S.-born citizens. Like he says here,
American grown and born, and if we have somebody that bops an old woman over the head and shoots people all over the place, and then has a bad judge or a bad prosecutor that do nothing about him, all they worry about is politics, and don't worry about that. I think if we could get El Salvador or somebody to take them, I'd be very happy with it, but I have to see what the law says.
So the threat of deportation is not just migrants. It's now escalated to U.S. citizens. Let's go back to the chain of events with tariffs. He wants to pressure Jerome Powell to cut interest rates, which is basically implement quantitative easing during a time that it normally would not, since we're coming off from an era of quantitative tightening and an era of high inflation. He wants to basically simulate the March 2020 economic conditions that we saw here in this green zone down here, which forced the Fed to implement QE. So if he can artificially create that environment, then he can pressure the Fed to do what it did before in his first term. There are important reasons why Donald Trump wants lower interest rate besides just portfolios going up and appeasing his wealthy elite friends and the opportunists. The U.S. is at a major crossroads with the yield curve. Basically, what we're seeing is for the last 50 years, since 1980, since basically the Reagan era, is we've seen the decrease of yield rates, interest rates, which created this bond bull market. What started in the 1980s was the government deficit. And so when you have a large government deficit and you run an economic system based off deficits being okay and being good, which is actually the school of thought that was very prominent in my undergrad. I went to Cal State Fullerton. That is a predominantly Republican county. They're okay because you can just keep borrowing. Basically what we're seeing is that there are limitations to that, and so we are seeing there was a pivotal moment right here, again, pandemic era. During the pandemic era, our interest rates were at an all-time low, so borrowing is very cheap, crypto goes up, real estate goes up. What we're seeing is this 50-year reversal. So here we started in 51 till about the 80s. And then since then, we've been on a decline. And right here, we're seeing a golden cross, which is basically the crossover. It's just showing a trend reversal where we are basically going to start seeing higher interest rates, which could be devastating for the economy, which makes inflation not just transitory, but structural. And so Donald Trump wants to bring these rates down so that he can negotiate, because a lot of the leverage politically worldwide as far as global powers is held because a lot of countries hold US debt and we have to repay it. So there is a metric where if we start hitting 5%, it's going to be extremely expensive for the government to basically pay back the interest. And the recent 10-year bonds have been a sought out investment is because the US has never defaulted on its debt repayment. So that 5% is kind of the ceiling that we have to stay under. And this is the economy that Trump basically inherited. So this is avoid or stop the 50-year downtrend reversal of increasing yields. Avoid that 5% yield that makes debt interest repayments unsustainable. And this is a very key factor, because what Donald Trump is doing with these tariffs and this market chaos and this reorganization of power is that he's finding his limitations and his miscalculations. However, Donald Trump uses chaos, so it doesn't matter if the market's down or up. He manipulates that to further consolidate power, and that's why he's so dangerous. Even on Fox News, they had a segment where he said, even though I'm a patriot, I have to admit that Trump essentially capitulated, because what was happening right before he sent out the signal to it's a great time to buy, is that Japan started offloading government bonds, and Japan is the largest holder of US debt. Not China, it's Japan. And so what happened was there's so much instability that even holding US bonds is no longer safe. That's a huge threat. And so what happens when you offload so much debt so quickly, it drives down the price of bonds because they're not as valuable, and it drives up the yield. So there is an external force that has influence on our yield and interest rates, and it was starting to hit that 5% level.
Well, I mean, because of the mixed messaging, how can you doubt them? I mean, let's be clear what happened. Who capitulated here and why? And I don't want to say this because I'm a patriot. I'm an American. But it is the White House who capitulated based on everything I hear and all my sources. And the reason why is because of the bond market and what happened last night. Besant knows this better than anybody. When you have yields on the 10-year rising to 5%, stuff starts shutting down when you have the lending markets screwed up. By the way, who was dumping the bonds? Somebody asked them if it was China, right? Mm-hmm. It wasn't. It was Japan. While he was negotiating with Japan, according to my sources, who are running major money management firms that are involved in the bond market, without giving up names, Japan was dumping bonds because they believed this was not a great place to do business.
So Donald Trump pivoted and decided to send out his Truth Social post that this is a great time to buy. We've seen people like Marjorie Taylor Greene buying ahead of time and capitalizing on this moment. So, basically we're seeing insider trading happening in real time. And what that allows Trump to do is basically emulate what he learned from Elon Musk and what he rolled out with his Trump coin, which was essentially Elon Musk was able to purchase an entire social media platform so that he can directly influence his trades. That's why he got so behind on Doge and and sent out other signals for other meme coins that he could pump. And so Donald Trump essentially did that when he released Trump coin, and Trump coin was released 2 days before his inauguration. What we eventually saw in Trump coin was an entire pump and dump scheme. He holds 80% of the holdings for himself and the developers on a 3-year scheduled release. Further reinforces his ability to have direct influence on the market timings and when markets will react. And this idea that he was freaking out that the stock market was going down is absolute nonsense, because he's actually already seen his ability to dump on an entire market and still have influence, because it leaves people waiting for the next pump, for the next opportunity to capitalize on that. So Donald Trump does not fear stock market decline, because then he can keep the elites happy, because then he can consolidate power by making an economy dependent on him, by pleasing wealthy elites. And we saw that in the inauguration, where the front row is basically billionaires with front row seats, basically transforming this into an opportunist economy, eventually leading to a type of oligarchy, which is what we're seeing Bernie Sanders talk about, fighting the oligarchy, which is basically wealthy, powerful elites basically owning, the government. However, my argument is that not even billionaires are safe, because he is trying to basically replicate a Putin-like regime in which the billionaires were absorbed under Putin after a 1990s decade of extreme privatization, and how when he came into power, he basically shut down dissent by jailing or exiling his opponents. And so if you want to keep your wealth, if you want to keep your money or have access to government contracts, that you have to basically abide by Putin. So this entire condition, these entire market conditions, basically reinforce this loyalist political and economic structure, as Trump being the leading signal indicator and on his terms, which creates a feudal economy where loyalty means access, and that oligarchic order into authoritarianism, with the asterisk that billionaires are not safe either. This is not designed to help the everyday American. This is not designed to bring manufacturing back. We will talk about more specific in another video why tariffs does not bring manufacturing back. Essentially, he is destroying all the market conditions that would support good paying jobs, and how with the reduced number of manufacturing plants and reduced workforce, we still have a higher output of manufacturing and productivity than we did when we had these good paying jobs. So I hope I was able to give people an understanding that this is not an administration that we should underestimate, connect the chain of events, and how this is manufactured chaos for a reorganization of power to make Trump the leading influential force for a new global political and economic system in which loyalty grants you access. However, this comes with miscalculations, even in his ability to pivot. And this is a lot more intentionally and intelligently designed, instead of looking at this as incoherence and randomness. So I hope I was able to break that down. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope to make more videos just like this. If you have any feedback or advice or any comments, please leave them below. I would love to hear and connect with all of you guys. And you can find me on all my social media platforms at Diane M. Romero. And I hope to see you guys again. Thank you.